Milk. My mother wouldn't be cowed into nursing and decided that formula was healthier than the liquid from her breasts. And so I never sucked a single drop from the source a river dried up. It was always bottled for me. But one night in my mid-30s, in a mirror room off Highway 59, a woman who had a baby daughter turned to me with an enigmatic smile and cupped my face in her chapped hands and tipped her nipple into my mouth. This happened a long time ago in another city, and it's wrong to tell about it. It was infantile to bring it up in therapy. And yet it's one of those moments, misplaced, involuntary, that swim up out of the past without a conscience. She lifts my face and I taste it. The sudden spurting nectar, the incurable sweetness that is life. Robert Frost said that if there are 29 poems in a book, then the book itself is the 30th poem. So I decided to see all of my work in selecting it as a kind of journey or structure or that 30th poem. And so I was taking the poems out of one context, but I was putting them into another one to try and make a more unified whole. And one of the things I became very conscious of in putting together The Living Fire is I would call them certain motifs in my work, which I tried to emphasize. And I think that's why you're getting a sense that time doesn't matter. For example, some of the earliest poems in The Living Fire from my first book, For the Sleepwalkers, are about insomnia. And I was mostly writing then, because I've always been an insomniac, and I was writing out of my own sleeplessness. And I also wrote a lot at night when I was younger. And over time, I recognized that that was a subject that I really liked in poetry. Not just that I was an insomniac, but I liked the feeling that insomnia created inside a poem. I liked the sense of the speaker in a poem being a solitary consciousness, the only one awake, as if the rest of the world is entirely asleep. And I like the loneliness that creates, the feeling of loneliness, the solitary quality, the sense of a mind at work, the kind of way the mind is loosened for its daydreaming capacities, for reverie. Ordinary sight is suppressed. The mind moves with a kind of freedom through the world, as in Whitman's wonderful poem, The Sleepers. So I would say that I hit upon insomnia more self-consciously as I went through time as a kind of subject of a person alone at night. I have many influences in poetry, and they've changed over time, but I think one of the things that's been consistent is I've always felt a deep affinity with romantic poetry, where emotional intensity takes on a kind of primacy, and the emotion is determining. And so I guess I would see myself in one way in a lineage of American romantic poets that would go back through Hart Crane, Wallace Stevens, to Emerson and Whitman over here, and to the English romantics, especially Keats, on the other side of the ocean. But I would say that's complicated for me by the fact that I've always been a devoted internationalist. And although I myself am an American poet, I'm very proud of being an American poet, very conscious of being an American poet. I am an American poet who doesn't just look to local sources or to vernacular sources. I have a strong sense that American poetry is part of world poetry. And when I was in my early 20s, in particular, I began to discover other poetic models than English and American models. And one of the reasons is that I found, as great as it is, American modernist poetry, I found to be cold. Brilliant, but cold. And in fact, coldness was an ideal for T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, who wanted to see the poem as a kind of sculpture. And I was looking for, and they considered anything that was too heated sentimental. And I was looking for other models of poetry that were not sentimental, but that brought more tenderness into poetry with intellectual rigor. And in looking around, that's when I found some of the great Latin American poets like Pablo Neruda and Cesar Vallejo, and other Spanish poets like Miguel Hernandez and Garcia Lorca, as well as a group of Eastern European poets, especially the Polish poets, who wrote with so much brilliant rigor, but as individuals in time, with a greater feeling of human scale, with a greater amount of tenderness. And yet they were also very historically conscious. And so here I discovered Czesław Miłosz and Zbigniew Herbert. I discovered Paul Celan. I discovered the Hungarian poets Attila József and Miklos Radnati and others. And these models from other countries have always informed my poetry and my sense of what I wanted poetry to be. I would say that American poetry has some sense of history, but I would say in general it's weakened because Americans have a weak sense of history. And so American poetry, although it's somewhat historically conscious, hasn't been as historically conscious as other poetries. You know, there's a deep strain in American culture of what Henry Ford said, history is bunk. There's a strong sense that we create ourselves and we recreate ourselves, and that history doesn't matter, that we determine our own destiny. But we're also subject to history, and poets from small countries are aware that they don't entirely control their own destinies. They're also subject to historical forces. You can't be a Palestinian poet or a Hebrew poet and feel that you're completely in charge of your destiny. You can't be a Polish poet with its proximity to Germany on the one side or to the Soviet Union on the other and feel that you've been totally in charge of your destiny. So these poets write with a historical consciousness that's been very instructive to me, and I've tried to bring it into my own work. The greatest poetry seems to me shadowed by mortality. There's something unbearable, in my opinion, about being human, and that's that we're going to die, that we live in time. And there's something that's extremely hard for us to wrap our minds around, that we live in time. And I think the greatest poems are shadowed by death, and that there's a strong feeling that what we're living will pass. It will vanish, and eventually it will be obliterated. And I think poetry tries to take a stand against time. It speaks against our vanishing. It speaks on behalf of our living. It takes sides. It argues that when we were here, it mattered, and what we felt mattered. And if you want what you feel to matter, then poetry seems to me your form, your type. My own poems, I think, have always been driven by this sense that I have an overwhelming inner life, inner feeling, and it needs some kind of articulation to get out. And also, if the people you care about matter to you, and if what you felt about them matter to you, as they have to me, then you want to somehow make it last. You want to somehow make them last. You want to somehow create a kind of memorial to your feelings, to what existed. And I've always written this sense to try and, with a sense of trying to save something from vanishing, to try and keep something. This poem is an elegy for a beloved dog I had, a standard poodle. I lived in Houston. I used to live across the street from the Menil Museum, and my dog Rocky and I would walk over down to the Rothko Chapel, and there was a Barnett Newman sculpture called Broken Obelisk behind it. And this poem is about those walks that Rocky and I took. Anything but standard. It was the two of us, wasn't it, on those steamy nights, circling the low-slung museum across the street and lingering by the pond behind the chapel. It's how the southern clouds pass slowly overhead, season after season, year after year, as you followed a low, intricate scent across the stately lit lawn, and studied the squirrels and the live oaks, and waded into the brown reflecting pool with the broken obelisk. You were a descendant of water dogs and anything but standard when you materialized out of the sticky heat with your dripping black forehead and delinquent grin, a growl unmuzzled. It was your Russian face that steadied me as I sat on a battered wooden bench, lost in a night that wouldn't end, and you lay down, calm, poised, watchful, and stirred beside me on the simmering grass. Let's get up and go. Trot ahead of me, old friend, and shake off the watery darkness.